couple decades back, I had a buddy, we'll call him Lester, and Lester said he was psychic. Now, at the time, I didn't dismiss that as prima facie bullshit because I actually believed that was a real thing. I actually thought some people had psychic powers, so hey, why not Lester? He seemed like a pretty smart guy. I was inclined to believe him, but unfortunately for my potential career in bullshit, I still wanted evidence. See, like many other people who were new to the world of woo, I was convinced that at some point, if I looked hard enough, I'd find evidence. Not proof necessarily, but a single piece of evidence at least that would be easier to explain if woo was right and science was wrong. And at first, I figured that should be a pretty simple task, but over and over again, every promising lead would turn to dust. So here I was with what appeared to be a genuine psychic. After all, his girlfriend agreed wholeheartedly with his precognitive proclivity, so I put him to the test. Now, at first, he was pretty stoked about this. I drew up some Zener cards. You might remember those from the opening of Ghostbusters where Bill Murray's trying to fuck the hairspray hoarder lady. And basically, it's just a series of cards with symbols on them we generally associate with the numbers 1 through 5. A circle for 1, a plus for 2, 3 wavy lines for 3, etc. I drew up 100 of those, 20 of each symbol, and I shuffled them up and awaited Lester's arrival. So he gets there, we run through all 100 of them. Of course, by chance, he should be picking something like 20% of them correctly. More than that, really, if he's bothering to keep track of which ones had already come out. Like, at the end, you could know that there were no more squares or pluses in the deck and ramp up your odds considerably. But disregarding all of that, we decided entirely arbitrarily that our standard deviation was going to be 10%. We decided that one could probably guess 30% of the time just by getting lucky and not by being psychic. So we ran him through the deck. I recorded all his answers, I summed it up, and sure enough, no sign of psychic ability. He came in right around 21, 22% or so. So we decided to run him again, and we did, and he did worse, but still right about 20% or so. But I'd be damned if I was going to give up that easy. After all, how often does one get such a ripe opportunity to prove all of human knowledge to be an error? So we adjusted the test. I asked if he could come back a couple days later when I could have a few friends over. Then, instead of me looking at a card and him trying to read my mind, several people could look at the card and he could try to develop a psychic connection with any of them. Lester thought this was a splendid idea. He also reminded me that his psychic abilities always worked best when he was high, so maybe we should smoke a shitload of weed before we did it again. And I thought that was a splendid idea. So we did. A couple days later, he comes back. We fog out my living room. We try again, twice. 200 guesses, again. And again, no sign of psychic ability. We did have one trial that was pretty high compared to what he'd done before, but not enough to crack what we had agreed in advance was the psychic level. So he parted company, and I was left poring over a data sheet that very clearly showed random chance in action. But I didn't want it to show that, so I squinted. And when that didn't help, I closed my left eye, I turned the paper 40 degrees to the right, held up my left hand, spread out the fingers, and when I only looked at the data between my middle finger and my ring finger, it turned out Lester was psychic after all. So the next day I come back and I said, hey, bro, I think I figured out the problem. See, I'm looking over the numbers. I'm noticing that you usually start slow and you close bad, but in the middle there, you tend to do really well. And that all made sense to me in like a motivated reasoning kind of way. After all, you got to warm up those psychic powers, don't you? You can't just come in cold, and then eventually they'll start to wear out. So if I ignore the first 12 trials and assume his psychic ability starts crapping out around trial number 70 or so, I notice he actually does cross over the line. He actually is psychic. So I go back through our extensive data set of 4 trials and notice that this pattern holds almost all the time. Actually, in one of them, he actually did worse if I did it that way. But in the other 3, he does significantly better. And that one outlier shouldn't count. After all, that was the second trial on the first day. He was already worn out when we started. So I say, hey, let's do that experiment one more time, Lester, but we're only going to do 70 trials and we'll throw out the first 15 or so. We'll call that your warm-up period. But suddenly, Lester didn't want to play anymore. See, at this point, I could still contort my reasoning just enough to justify calling him psychic as long as I got to make up the rules as I went along. But Lester seemed to know where this was going. If I ran this test and it failed, I'd probably come up with something else, and that would also fail. And I'd come up with something else, which would also fail. And at a certain point, I'd give up, and Lester would have to deal with the fact that he wasn't psychic, and Lester did not want that. See, this is a gauntlet that all woo merchants, religious people, and otherwise self-deluded folk have to pass through. There comes a point when you recognize that more knowledge, more information, more data can only serve to hurt you. Now, some of us keep going. We keep hunting for that data until we reluctantly admit that it isn't there to find. There's no such thing as magic, and Lester was just a combination of full of shit and good at guessing. But others don't pass through that way. They end up staying there or finding some side exit or whatever. They intentionally stop gathering information, or else they vet it more carefully to make sure their assumptions are never going to get challenged by what they learn. They intentionally refuse to learn enough to make themselves wrong. And that's why much of the time, it doesn't matter whether they're lying. We spend a lot of time as atheists on this, do these Jesus peddling millionaires actually believe what they're selling? Does that palm reading charlatan know she's a con artist, or has she convinced herself she has superpowers? But this is not an either or question. You can both know and not know you're lying, because as soon as you actively stop trying to learn, you've admitted to yourself that your beliefs won't and can't hold up to scrutiny. So every time anybody ever went into a Christian bookstore or logged into a spiritual website or took their kids to a creationist museum, they're already admitting they're lying. They may not have said it out loud, but their actions betray the truth. They know they're lying, whether they know it or not.